The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the deserted excavation site. The rusted remains of an old iron casket had been discovered deep in the woods, buried under layers of soil and history, seemingly untouched by time. For the archaeologists working on the site, this was more than just another find. This was something old, a piece of the past that had been hidden away for over a century. The casket was small, its iron sides covered with a thick layer of decay, the metal itself rusted and fragile. Despite the wear and tear, the shape was unmistakable, a child's casket. But what was inside was still unknown, and the team knew they were on the verge of something monumental. Dr. Samuel Jenkins, a leading expert in historical burial practices, knelt beside the casket, his hands carefully brushing away the dirt and debris. He could see the faint outline of the iron frame, its edges marked by corrosion. "It's incredible," he murmured to his assistant, Clara, who was watching intently. Clara leaned closer, the smell of earth and rust filling her nostrils as she studied the object. "It's so small. It's hard to believe." She glanced at the surrounding forest, feeling a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. The whole area had a quiet, eerie stillness about it, as though something was watching them. The casket was unusual, designed differently from the typical caskets of the period. The iron was heavily rusted, the edges sharp where the corrosion had begun to eat through the material. But what stood out the most was the engraving on the top. Faint, worn, but still legible was the name, Emma C. Westbrook. Emma. Dr. Jenkins repeated the name softly, running his fingers over the engraving. "She must have been buried in the late 1800s. Clara nodded, her eyes scanning the casket. "What happened to her?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The discovery was thrilling, yes, but also disturbing. A child's casket, so small and seemingly untouched by time, felt like a violation of the past. "We'll find out soon enough," Dr. Jenkins replied, his voice tight with anticipation. He motioned to the rest of the team, signaling that they should begin the process of carefully extracting the casket. "Let's get this open." They worked together, lifting the casket carefully from its resting place. The weight was lighter than expected, but the air around them grew thicker, as if the world was holding its breath. Clara could feel it too, that heavy stillness, the odd sensation that something was wrong. As the casket was raised, the sunlight seemed to dim, as though the clouds had thickened overhead, casting a shadow over the entire site. With a final effort, the casket was placed gently on the table, ready to be opened. Everyone stood in hushed silence as Dr. Jenkins reached for his tools, carefully prying open the rusted latch. The sound of the hinges creaking echoed through the air, and then the lid was raised. The moment it opened, a wave of cold filled the air, a chill that wasn't natural. Clara shivered, stepping back, her breath catching in her throat. There, inside the casket, was a child's body. But what they saw next made their blood run cold. The little girl inside, despite the time that had passed, appeared remarkably preserved. Her face, though pale, still held the faintest trace of a serene expression, as though she were merely sleeping. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, the fabric faded but still holding its form, and her long dark hair had been neatly arranged around her head, though matted with dirt and age. It wasn't the girl's appearance that left the team speechless, though. It was what she was holding. Nestled carefully in her hands, wrapped tightly in cloth, was something that shouldn't have been there. Something that made everyone pause. A small, weathered box, its surface covered in strange markings, symbols that none of the archaeologists recognized. "What is that?" Clara gasped, leaning forward. The box looked ancient, far older than anything they had uncovered. The symbols were carved into the surface in patterns that seemed to shift as she looked at them. Dr. Jenkins frowned, eyes narrowing in concentration. "I don't know, but this is far beyond anything I expected to find." The tension was palpable. Something was wrong. The child's casket, this seemingly innocent find, had turned into something much darker. It was as if they had uncovered not just the remains of a long-forgotten child, but something far more ominous, something that had been buried for a reason. The air felt thick with tension as Dr. Jenkins stared at the strange box in the little girl's hands. It was as though the world had stopped moving, Everything around them faded into a blur, leaving only the mysterious object that had now taken center stage in their minds. Clara couldn't look away from it. The box, though small, seemed to hold an incredible amount of weight, as if it carried something far more dangerous than its appearance suggested. The markings etched into it were unlike anything she had ever seen. They resembled ancient hieroglyphs, but there were no known records of any civilization using such symbols. It was something new, something foreign. "What is this?" Clara whispered again, her voice barely a breath. "I don't know," Dr. Jenkins replied, his face pale. He reached for the box with careful hands, but even as he touched it, a strange sensation ran through him, a sense of cold dread that seemed to come from deep within the tomb itself. He paused, hand hovering over the box, uncertain if he should touch it. "Dr. Jenkins, are you sure we should?" Megan, one of the younger team members, asked with visible concern. Her eyes were wide, the unease on her face matching everyone else's. "Something about this doesn't feel right." He turned to her, noticing the worry in her eyes, and hesitated for a moment. He had faced countless archaeological discoveries over the years, but this was unlike anything else. The discovery of the casket itself had been a stroke of luck, but now with this box, things were beginning to feel like they had crossed a line. But his curiosity, his obsession with the unknown, overcame his fear. He had to know what this was. He had to uncover the truth. Slowly, he lifted the box from the little girl's hands, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold, weathered surface. The instant he touched it, the room seemed to shift. The atmosphere thickened, the air growing heavier around them. The sound of their breathing echoed loudly in the silence, each inhale and exhale feeling too loud. It was as if the tomb had come alive, reacting to the disturbance. The walls seemed to hum, low and almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. Dr. Jenkins opened the box. Inside there was a small, faded parchment, wrapped carefully in worn cloth. The paper looked as though it had been handled repeatedly over the centuries, the edges tattered and frayed. The writing on it was unlike any script they had ever seen. It was flowing, ornate, yet strangely unsettling, as though the words were trying to move on the page. The symbols seemed to distort as his eyes shifted, like they were almost alive, shifting in the dim light of their torches. "What is this?" Megan asked, now visibly pale, stepping back slightly. Dr. Jenkins ran his fingers over the parchment, scanning the strange symbols. His eyes widened as a cold realization struck him. This isn't just a burial." His voice trembled. "This is a curse, not a grave." The realization hit everyone in the room at once. The markings on the parchment seemed to indicate ritualistic practices, and not in the typical sense of burial rites. These were symbols of protection, but not the kind one would expect for the dead. These were designed to keep something sealed, something locked away. Suddenly, everything clicked. The small casket, the ancient markings, the eerie stillness. They had uncovered more than a simple burial. The child, Emma, wasn't just part of a historical find. She had been the guardian of something much darker, something the ancient civilization had tried to conceal. Dr. Jenkins stepped back, his hands shaking, clutching the box tighter as the truth began to dawn on him. The child. She wasn't just a sacrifice. She was the key. Clara's face went pale as she started to piece together the dark implications. The box. The curse. She was meant to keep it sealed. The room fell silent, and they all turned to look at the mummy again. Emma, whose peaceful expression hid the terrible truth. She had been the one who kept the ancient evil contained, and now it was free. "We've opened it, haven't we?" Megan whispered. The horror of the discovery was clear in her voice. But before anyone could respond, a strange noise filled the air, faint at first but growing louder. It sounded like whispering, low and guttural, as if coming from the walls themselves. The sound seemed to echo off the stone surfaces of the tomb, vibrating through their bones. The room felt colder still, the air tightening, as if something unseen was closing in. The whispers were growing louder. They were no longer in the background but now seemed to have form. The walls were speaking. The tomb itself had come to life. Dr. Jenkins clenched his jaw, his mind racing. What had they uncovered? What had they released? He could no longer deny it. This wasn't just an archaeological discovery. They had disturbed something ancient, something uncontainable. "We need to leave, Doctor," Jenkins said, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. "We need to seal this tomb again, before it's too late." But even as he spoke those words, a cold wind blew through the room, extinguishing their torches, plunging them into pitch-black darkness. And in that darkness, the whispers grew into a screeching wail, a terrifying sound, ancient and full of rage. It was as if the tomb itself was now awake, furious that it had been disturbed. The air grew oppressively still, the deep, unsettling whispers now rising into loud, frantic cries, echoing throughout the tomb. The walls trembled, the stone reverberating under the weight of something ancient, something that had been held in place for centuries. And now it was angry. Dr. Jenkins gripped the box tighter, as if the object could somehow offer him protection from the force that was stirring in the depths of the tomb. His team was frozen, their faces pale in the dim light of their flashlights, which flickered and sputtered, threatening to go out entirely. They could feel it, the pressure building in the air around them, an unnatural force that was invisible, but incredibly powerful. "What's happening?" Megan's voice trembled, her eyes darting around, searching for an escape that wasn't there. The tomb seemed to be closing in on them, the very walls shifting, becoming narrower, pressing against them. Nadia, one of the senior archaeologists, took a step back, her hand gripping her throat as if the air itself was choking her. "We've disturbed something. We've—" But before she could finish, the screaming whispers reached a deafening crescendo, and the stone floor beneath their feet shifted. A low growl, like an animal's, rumbled from deep within the tomb's bowels. It was followed by a crack so loud, it felt like the very earth was splitting apart. Megan screamed, her voice high-pitched with terror, as she stumbled backward. The ground beneath them shuddered again, and this time, a deep fissure appeared in the floor, a gaping crack running from one side of the tomb to the other. A dark wind began to swirl around them, and out of the darkness, something else began to form. Figures, silhouettes at first, shadowy, indistinct forms moving in the corners of the room, coming from the darkness of the newly opened crack. Nadia stumbled, her flashlight flickering wildly, then cutting out completely, plunging them into total darkness. The only light now came from the faint glow of the ancient markings on the walls, casting twisted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. And then, out of the dark abyss, a tall, cloaked figure stepped forward. It was humanoid, but its form was distorted, its features flickering, as if the figure couldn't quite maintain its shape. Its eyes, glowing a dull amber, stared directly at them, piercing through the darkness. It was silent at first, standing like an ancient sentinel, watching them, waiting. Nadia's heart raced in her chest. "What is that?" she whispered, too afraid to speak louder. "It's not human," Rajiv said, his voice trembling. He took a cautious step back, but the figure remained unmoving, its gaze never faltering. The temperature dropped further, so cold it seemed to cut through their skin, making it hard to breathe. It was as if the very tomb itself was becoming a prison, and they were trapped inside it. The whispers returned, louder now, but not from the walls. The voices came from all around them, from the shadows, from the figures that were gathering in the corners of the tomb. They were speaking in a language no one understood, their voices overlapping, merging into a cacophony of sound that felt like it was shaking the very foundation of the tomb. We need to leave," Megan gasped, pulling at her friend's arms. "We need to get out of here." But as she turned to move, she froze. The door, the only exit, had vanished. The entrance to the tomb was now completely sealed, stone blocks shifting to cover the opening as if they had never been there. "No, no!" Megan cried, her voice shaking in panic. The figure stepped forward again, its movements unnaturally fluid. It reached up, its arm elongating with an eerie stretching motion that made Nadia's blood run cold. As the figure's hand reached toward them, the air grew heavier. And then, it spoke. Its voice was low, gravelly, and filled with an unnatural power. "You have awakened what was meant to remain buried." The words echoed in their minds, as though the creature was speaking directly to their souls. bypassing language altogether. The tomb seemed to shudder again, and the lights flickered wildly before going out completely. For a moment, all they could hear was the sound of their own breathing, shallow and quick, their hearts pounding in their chests. And then, from the deep shadows, another voice joined in, the voice of a child, barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have opened it." The figure's amber eyes gleamed in the darkness, and the coldness in the room grew unbearable. It was as though the very tomb was closing in on them, shrinking, tightening around their bodies. The shadows moved, slithering across the walls like tendrils, reaching for them. The last thing they heard before the tomb plunged into complete darkness was the child's voice, faint but clear, repeating one chilling sentence. "The curse has been released. Now it cannot be undone." The sound of the child's voice, still echoing in the abyss, hung in the air like a final warning. "The curse has been released. Now it cannot be undone." The words reverberated in the darkness, chilling them to the bone. The tomb had become a living entity, pulsating with ancient power, and the walls felt like they were slowly closing in on them. Nadia's mind raced. The curse, the whispers, the figures. Had they really unleashed something that could never be contained? She was an archaeologist, someone who believed in the tangible, the factual, yet here she was, facing something that defied explanation. There was no denying it now. The tomb was alive, and it wanted them. The shadows were closing in, like tendrils of darkness, reaching for them. The figures moved, slithering, their outlines constantly shifting, as though they were made of pure shadow. Nadia's heartbeat quickened as she turned to her team, all of them visibly shaken, unable to move. "We need to get out." "Now," Dr. Jenkins said, his voice shaking with urgency. He had led them into this tomb, but now as fear gripped him, he wasn't sure they would make it out alive. But no matter how fast they ran, no matter how hard they pushed against the walls, they were trapped. The door, once their means of escape, had vanished, sealed by an unseen force. The walls now seemed to stretch upward, towering above them, the room narrowing as if it was alive, feeding on their fear. Megan, in a panic, clawed at the walls. "There has to be a way out," she cried, her voice breaking as she banged on the stone. But the stone was unyielding, cold and hard beneath her fingertips. The shadows, still stretching toward them, were moving faster now, encroaching on their space, pulling them deeper into the tomb. The temperature had dropped to frigid levels, and Nadia could see her breath clouding in front of her, like a sign that they were slowly suffocating. Clara, her face pale and full of terror, grabbed Nadia's arm. "What is happening?" she whispered. Her voice trembled with disbelief. "We can't just stand here. We need to get out of here before it's too late." Nadia didn't answer immediately. She was too overwhelmed by the weight of the dark force pressing on her chest, the weight of the tomb pressing on them all. They were running out of time, but then a faint glimmer of light appeared in the darkness. It flickered and shimmered like a beacon, guiding them forward. Nadia squinted, her heart racing as she turned to the others. "Look, there!" "What is that?" Rajiv asked, his voice barely audible over the growing rumble that seemed to emanate from the walls. The ground trembled again, but this time, it wasn't from the collapsing tomb. It was from something deeper, something that was beginning to awaken. The light grew brighter and suddenly a stone archway appeared where there had been none before. It seemed to materialize out of the stone, glowing with a faint blue aura, almost as if it were offering them a way out. "That's our way out," Dr. Jenkins shouted, his voice full of renewed hope. He ran toward the archway, the rest of the team following closely behind, eager to escape the ever-encroaching shadows. But as they approached, the air grew thicker, almost suffocating. The shadows seemed to lash out at them, as if resisting their escape, trying to pull them back into the depths of the tomb. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, swirling around them. "Don't let them get us!" Megan cried, struggling to keep up as the shadows reached for her legs, trying to drag her down. But Nadia reached out, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her toward the archway. With one final effort, they made it to the glowing archway. But as they crossed the threshold, the ground beneath them cracked open, and the tomb seemed to come alive, its walls collapsing inward as the shadows screamed in agony. Just as they thought they had escaped, the darkness surged forward, but it stopped just short of the archway, as though an invisible barrier had been put in place. The shadows lashed out, but they could not pass through the glowing light. They had made it. For now. The archway's glow faded, and the tomb fell silent. The oppressive weight that had once held them in place was gone, and the air around them began to feel lighter. But as Nadia looked around, her heart still pounding, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The tomb might have been sealed for now, but the curse was still out there, lurking in the shadows. And whatever was inside, whatever they had disturbed, was far from finished. The tomb was silent. The oppressive shadows that had once surrounded them had receded, leaving only an eerie quiet in its wake. The archway, once glowing with an unnatural light, had now disappeared, fading into the stone as if it had never existed. The team stood in the middle of the now desolate and quiet tomb, still shaken from their harrowing escape. Dr. Jenkins took a deep breath, his chest heaving as though the weight of the tomb's curse had finally lifted. But even as he exhaled, there was a sense of dread lingering in the air. The whispers had ceased, the growls were no longer echoing through the walls, but the absence of sound felt wrong. The tomb had become still, but something deep within it still stirred. We made it, Rajiv whispered, wiping sweat from his brow, though his voice still trembled. The fear hadn't left him, none of them. There was something about this place, something about what they had uncovered, that made it feel like they weren't truly safe. Nadia nodded, but her expression was grim. We haven't escaped, Rajiv. Her voice was barely above a whisper. We've bought ourselves time. She turned to the others, their faces reflecting the same fear. An unspoken understanding that the curse they had released was not something that could be easily sealed again. The tomb had woken, and whatever was inside it, whatever it had been protecting, was now free. What do we do now? Clara's voice was shaky, filled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. They were all exhausted, physically and mentally. The horrors they had witnessed were far beyond their comprehension. Nadia paused, considering her next words carefully. We go back to the surface. We find a way to get the information we need and get this out. She felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach as the words left her mouth. She had been a scientist for too long, always seeking knowledge, always wanting to uncover the truth. But now she feared the truth might be too much for them to bear. The curse had already taken hold. The air outside the tomb had been thick with an unnatural cold, and it felt like the world around them was waiting, watching, knowing that something had shifted in the ancient tomb. What they had uncovered wasn't just an artifact, it was a door to something ancient, dark, and relentless. Suddenly the ground beneath them shuddered, just once, like a low tremor, a reminder that the earth had not forgotten what they had disturbed. We need to leave now, before it's too late, Nadia said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. They all turned toward the exit of the tomb. It had remained open since they had fled, and they could see the light of the world beyond, the blue sky and the warm desert sun. But the tomb, now empty, was still alive with an energy they could not escape. The curse was out there, waiting to consume the world, just as it had been contained for so long. The team stepped cautiously out of the tomb, still tense, their senses heightened. As they stepped into the daylight, the shadows seemed to follow them, trailing just beyond their reach, clinging to the very edges of their consciousness. They could feel it, the darkness that had been awakened. But when Nadia turned back to look at the tomb, the ground around it seemed to shift. The tomb, once a burial site, now felt like a living thing. The stone walls still pulsing with power, as if it were alive, aware of their escape. The curse had been set free, but the tomb wasn't finished with them yet. And in the back of her mind, Nadia could hear the whispers again, soft, distant, but unmistakable. The tomb wasn't done. It was only just beginning. As the team walked away, they could not shake the feeling that their lives had been changed forever. The world had been altered, and they were now part of something much larger, much darker than they had ever imagined. The echoes of the past had awakened, and with it, the horrors that had been hidden in the tomb for centuries.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.